Hello, hello to those tuning in. Hope you're all jolly and merry this time of year, regardless of how you choose to spend the holiday season. This is Jeremy Brown, your host for today's retrospective of 1974's Black Christmas, written by Roy Moore and directed by Bob Clark.
A high school girl's been murdered. Mr. Harrison's daughter is missing. And now at the house where she lives, the other girls are getting obscene phone calls.
Yeah, what I've done is I've tapped this phone so that when it rings, it'll ring at the station house, too.
There was a little girl murdered over in the park tonight. Yes, I heard.
Let me just start by saying that I'm very fortunate to finally getting around to talking a little bit about this movie, as I've regrettably been putting it off for well over a few years, and it's a classic I find myself revisiting more and more around the holidays, and I like noticing something new and different with each viewing. A lot of people have their go-to flicks when it comes to this festive, albeit stressful time of year. For some, it could be Ron Howard's The Grinch, Home Alone, National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, It's a Wonderful Life, Die Hard, Bad Santa, the Rankin Bass Christmas films, Gremlins, Batman Returns, Jingle All the Way. Hell, there's some films you forget that even take place on Christmas, like Julien Moy's Inside. I might have just butchered that name, I'm sorry. Now, I could theoretically dig to China with a long list of all these classics, but to get to the point, there's a little something out there for everyone. And look, a lot of those films are all fine and dandy, but for me though, I'm a Black Christmas guy. I love the hell out of this movie on varying degrees, and it astonishes me even after all these years, not enough people have seen it still, let alone tune into it as one of the old-time classics to watch. But you could say a lot of that has to do with its reputation as a Christmas slasher film, which, to be honest, is not in line with the quintessential tropes you'd typically want to associate with the holidays. Heartwarming, fun, and family-friendly, this film is not. I mean, it's in the title, Black Christmas. It's of course going to be bleak and unsettling, and it's ironic that the film's director, Bob Clark, almost a whole decade later after Black Christmas, would direct probably the most commercially successful holiday movie of all time, A Christmas Story. Now, very recently on the platform known as Shudder, horror host and critic Joe Bob Briggs of the Last Drive-In with Joe Bob Briggs series streamed Black Christmas as part of his holiday special, and quite frankly, he did an immeasurably good job, as always, diving into all the behind-the-scenes tidbits regarding the film and how it stood the test of time today. His take was so good, there's really not a whole lot I could add to the discussion other than my own experience with the film and maybe a couple little fan theories, if you want to call them that I have regarding the storyline and the killer in it. So, to take you back in time a bit, I discovered Black Christmas watching Bravo's 100 Scariest Movie Moments on late night cable, and while I recognized a lot of the films I had either read about or seen, when the program got to this movie, I grew intrigued. In quite literally a minute and a half of Bravo's coverage, I was getting the rundown of how important Black Christmas was for horror cinema. By many film fans and critics, it's taken this prestige as the first true slasher horror film at the time, with many technical and creative choices that would influence John Carpenter's Halloween years later. Let me just preface this. While I think the slasher subgenre owes quite a lot to Black Christmas, I think most of us believe that status can easily be debated and taken farther back to films such as Mario Bava's Blood and Black Lace, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, Michael Powell's Peeping Tom. Hell, I'd even put Charles Laughton's Night of the Hunter in that camp. And who knows, there's probably a bundle of Roger Corman films out there that beat everyone to it, though that's a whole other discussion for another time. But I will give Black Christmas this. It is the first holiday-themed slasher film, as far as I know, relative to the mainstream. Now, going back, I would hit up my local Hollywood video here and there just to hunt down this movie and get my parents to rent it, but for some reason, either the rental store never had a copy, or someone was always checking the movie out because I could never find it in the horror section. Now, perhaps if I had bothered to check the holiday movie section, it very well could have been lumped in with movies like Elf, or Grandma Got Run Over by a Reindeer, because those just make perfect sets. So I started to forget about the movie over the years and drifted off to other things until my family had started using Netflix's streaming service, and lo and behold, Black Christmas was available to watch one day as I was browsing. Keep in mind, too, this was the early days of Netflix streaming, back when they had a roster of eclectic films to choose from that you may never have heard of or had access to, as opposed to now, where, you're bombarded with all these factory produced shows and, I don't know, Aziz Ansari's latest stand up special. There's just a ton of crap on Netflix, but I digress. Black Christmas was every bit as chilling and effective as I had hoped it would be when I finally watched it for the first time in the summer, and since then I've spent many Decembers returning to it, and I'm still impressed with it to this day. Just so you know, from here, I am definitely going to go into some spoilers regarding the story, so if you have not seen Black Christmas yet and plan to watch it, I would ask that you get yourself a copy or stream it before listening to the rest of this podcast. If you don't have any interest in seeing the movie, um, for your sanity, I don't know why you're listening to this other than, you might like the sound of my voice. All right. Well, you've been warned. For context, Black Christmas was a Canadian production inspired by the urban legend known as The Babysitter and the Man Upstairs, the story that also inspired When a Stranger Calls in 1979, asking the babysitter if she has checked the children yet. It was also loosely influenced by the chronicling series of murders within the Westmount suburb of Montreal, Quebec. The film opens on a dark night exterior of a sorority house in the snowy winter. We then cut to the POV of an unseen force sneaking into the attic, while the house's tenants are having a celebration on the main floor. He gets a good look at the party before further exploring the house, and for a long time this is how the film is largely played out. People completely oblivious to a killer living in their house, carrying on with their lives and conversations. The phone rings, and we're greeted to some of the main characters, including Jess Bradford, played by Olivia Hussey, Barb Cord, played by Margot Kidder, Phil Carlson, played by Andrea Martin, and Claire Harrison, played by Lynn Griffin. They gather around to witness some of the most unsettling and psychotic phone dialogue ever recorded from a character named Billy, who with a possible split personality ranging from grunts, howls, animal noises to sexual threats.
He's expanded his act.
Could that be one person?
No, Claire, that's the Mormon Tabernacle Choir doing their annual obscene phone call.
Little do they know that these various phone calls are coming from within the house. Barb, being the wild drunk of the group, provokes the caller with further insults, and this disturbs Claire enough to flee and pack her things for the holidays upstairs. Unfortunately, the character that knows she wants out ends up being the first victim. After hearing a series of cat meows from her closet, she approaches the sounds only to allow the killer to suffocate her with the hanging plastic clothes bags. None of this is heard from the rest of the girls downstairs as their house mother, Mrs. Mack, comes by for the party, giving the killer enough time to drag Claire's body to the attic. Now, it's made obvious that this house mother likes to get her drink on as she keeps random bottles of whiskey hidden all over the house, in library books and underneath toilet lids. The very next day, Claire's dad arrives in town, wondering why Claire still hasn't shown up at their meeting spot, and he heads up to the sorority house only to be greeted by Mrs. Mack with no clue where she could be either. They begin a wild goose chase with Barb, Jess, and Phil joining the search, and they put in a missing persons report at the police station. In a very funny scene, Barb tells the police officer her number, which later on gets a good laugh out of the rest of the investigation department.
Could you give me the number at the sorority house? Please.
Yeah, sure. It's, Fellatio 20880. Fellatio. It's a new exchange. FE.
It's a new one on me. How do you spell it?
Capital F, E, little L, Latio.
Thanks.
Don't mention.
Now, I wasn't alive in the 1970s, but this was at a time when a lot of phone numbers had letter codes as prefixes, and it's used as a fun gag to get a sense of how aloof this cop is. I'll say this real quick, the movie is not without its sense of humor from time to time, which is more and more in line with where Bob Clark's career was headed with Porky's and A Christmas Story. This not only helps relieve some tension, but even plays to some of the actors' strengths. Margot Kidder, who is still the best Lois Lane as far as I'm concerned, had a lot in common with the Barb character personality-wise. It's what drew her to the role, though many cast and crew have said that she was very distant from everyone on set. From what we know, Margot Kidder had a very complicated life off screen, I'll say that much. All the while, there's another subplot pulling the reins involving Jess and her boyfriend Peter, who's a once razor sharp pianist, now sort of losing his craft due to a lot of inner pressure he puts on himself, we can only assume. And he only becomes more disheartened to hear that Jess wants to abort the baby she reveals she's pregnant with. This sparks an emotional wedge between the two, and as Peter's pleas and outbursts getting more heavy handed and needy with each scene he's in, we're led to believe he could very well be behind the murders. He even sports the same hairstyle and green sweater as the killer, at least from what we can make out, but we know he's not. Mrs. Mack is killed off towards the second act as the only person in the film to bother going up in the attic in the first place. She vaguely makes out the body of Claire sitting in the rocking chair by the window, only to then take a crane hook to the face by Billy the killer, then hung up just enough above the attic door. More phone calls ensue to the point that everyone's favorite John Saxon is on to lead the investigation and enlists extra help to wire up the house's landline. It takes them a long time to track Billy's calls coming from the house, and we see that grueling process in a large room of phone circuits and strips that overpower each other with noise. Now, actually, I'm going to go off script here for a sec because this may be a controversial opinion here, and I could very well take it back in the future. But I think Black Christmas features the scariest and most realistic slasher villain I've ever seen. I mean that, and that's really a feat given you don't see much of him. Now, if we're talking favorites, that title would most likely go to Jason Voorhees or perhaps Mick Taylor, but because there's just a tantamount of mystery shrouding the killer within the corridors of this sorority house, and the uncanny sounds and mentally ill phrases coming out of his mouth are truly as uncomfortable as they are. I gotta give it to old Billy Boy here. Joe Spinell in Maniac and Leatherface from the first Chainsaw Massacre, they come really close. They really do. But I'm gonna have to keep my foot in this door for now, and we'll see. I may change my mind on that later on. But in his various phone calls, he puts on at least four distinct voices, two of which have names. Given his male voice and physique, I believe he is Billy first and foremost, but the other person is Agnes, who we're led to think could be his sister, while the nameless voices being that of his mom and dad. The family is manifested in his own psychological torment from the past, and he decides to speak for all of them at once, but for a new audience over the phone. Now, I predict, though I could be overanalyzing, that Billy at one point killed his entire family in this very sorority house and was sent to an insane asylum years before he broke out and returned close to Christmas. Even from his POV sequences, we get the sense that he recognizes the house pretty well, at least knows his way around. Plus, all the clutter in the attic doesn't appear to belong to any of the sorority girls. What we get from Billy's account are cases of parental abuse from the father, sexual abuse between him and Agnes, and even the mother, and very possible murder of each family member. What happened in that house is all he knew, and decides to relive it all by projecting harm upon new victims, though I wouldn't say this makes for a motive, just a more creepy backstory of someone who is really messed up, though it is still not a lot of information to work with. Let's talk about Olivia Hussey for a minute, because damn what a fine actress she is, and always a surprise when she turns up in a film. Of her work, I've only ever seen the Ozploitation flick Turkey Shoot, really good one. Her role as Norma Bates in Psycho 4: The Beginning. She was in Stephen King's It, the miniseries, as Bill's wife. And of course, the film that put her on the map, Franco Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet, where she played the leading Capulet at the age of 15. Now, it's reported that Hussey was unsure about doing a horror film, as it would be her first, but was convinced by her psychic at the time that the film would be a knockout hit and it would be a smart career choice for her. Hussey brings a really down-to-earth and wholesome nature to her character who really just wants to pursue bigger ambitions in college. Sometimes her acting is a little over the top, and she doesn't even attempt an American accent, which may have been intentional, but for the most part, she is a standout, and I like how the colors of her clothing, a lot of yellows, blacks, and pinks, contrasts with all the Christmas colors you see a lot of the other characters around her wear. Anyways, in the harrowing climax, the film pits Jess up against the killer once Lieutenant Fuller informs her that the calls are coming from inside the house. Rather than leave, she decides to arm herself with a fire pick and slowly walk upstairs to make sure her friends are safe. At the sight of Barb's and Phil's laying corpses around the corner in a darkened bedroom, she shifts focus to an eyeball staring directly back at her in the crack of the door, this being the film's most iconic shot. Jess pushes the door back against him and flees for the basement, where, after a few minutes go by, and Billy wanders off, and Peter then breaks in down below. The police arrive on site not too long after. The dead body of Peter lies on Jess's petrified but conscious body. The cops put her in bed and leave her to rest. With the lights off, we're greeted with an impressive tracking shot where we still hear Billy's voice coming from the attic, followed by an impressive crane shot looming on a wide of the house's exterior once more, and the phone rings again. Then cut to credits. What's so funny and terrifying is how no one from start to finish, except the viewer, is aware that the bodies of Claire and Mrs. McHenry have not left their spots in the attic this entire time. If someone outside the house even bothered to nod their head up ever so slightly, they could easily see a still-looking Claire leaning by the attic window, plastic gagged and mouth gaped open, which in itself is one of the most haunting images of the film, so much so that it is plastered on a lot of the posters and merchandise. All the evidence is there, front and center, yet no one bothers to look for it. I think in any other scenario, this plot point would get criticized for its poor representation of how a police investigation should be arranged, right down to the characters not using common sense and putting two and two together. And I don't think this decision ever made the characters insufferable or idiotic. What I do think is that setting this narrative in a relatively small college town where a murder spree of this nature is unheard of adds to all the characters' emotions getting the better of them and being collectively blinded by the evil right in front of their eyes until it's too late, indicating they probably had this insane impression of the killer and where he could be hiding, when in actuality, he's making his presence pretty well known, at least from what we see in his shoes and from his perspective. Since everyone comes to a rough agreement that Jess's boyfriend Peter was more than likely responsible for the harassing and murdering, it gives the bodies left to rest in the attic a colder sting. But had the ending been altered, and we saw the extended scenery of Jessica's fate, or what had happened after that phone starts to ring, this plot point would raise more questions rather than end on a fulfilling, ambiguous note. Black Christmas was shot in Toronto, Canada, and made on a budget of a little over $600K. While the film had audiences and critics mixed at first, it grew praise over the years and has become a cult hit amongst historians and horror fanatics, to name a few. Now, I would be doing this retrospective a little disservice without at least mentioning the 2006 Dimension Films remake of the same name, followed by this year's recent Black Christmas by Blumhouse. Now, admittedly, the 2006 remake directed by Glenn Morgan I have not seen since 2012, I want to say, but I remember just being completely disappointed with how that film flat out disrespected the maturely paced and intensely suspenseful original. Not only was the film wildly off the walls, but it actually gave Billy the Killer a full-on backstory, similar to the one I was kind of theorizing about with the original, but really involving his family issues, and also tacked on a ton of screen time for him too. You know everything there is to know. I have heard that during pre-production, Ray Moore and Bob Clark wanted to originally give the killer a clear and present backstory similar to the remake, but opted out for the version we got, and for the better, I might add. The remake lacks the subtlety in its scores and really hammers in the blood and gore, although actually hearing about the behind-the-scenes story on the film's development, America's favorite scumbag Harvey Weinstein supposedly stepped on set and demanded that everything had to be gorier and torture-driven because that's what sells. This, of course, was during the run of the Saw and Hostel movies at the time. On top of all of that, the marketing was blatantly lying to audiences by including all of these second unit shots for the trailer, including a Saw-inspired trap that shreds its victims in the basement of the sorority house, and it also featured these stand-ins getting frozen underwater, which is nowhere to be seen in the actual movie. They clearly used every ploy they could to get butts in seats, and I don't think that's at all the fault of the director, but more the producing unit behind it. With all that said, I might consider revisiting the remake and see if it's possible I might like it in a new light, because I will say it is well shot, and very colorful compared to horror films at the time that were just very dull and gray looking, and director Glenn Morgan is supposedly a big fan of the original, inserting as many nods to it throughout his version. As for the 2019 movie, I really have no interest. The trailers looked abysmal, and according to most critics and audiences upon its release, my initial impression of it sounds accurate. I'm all for a film to have a message or a layer of social commentary, but when it overpowers or sacrifices what should be a good story with compelling characters and a scary concept, this is a horror movie, I'm led to believe. So you lose me when all you're doing is lecturing the audience rather than entertain. I've even seen some people bring up the abortion subplot in the 1974 film as some sort of political statement, even though Bob Clark and Olivia Hussey have openly dismissed this evaluation, claiming that the film was never once attempting to promote any pro life or pro choice message. To me, I always thought it was included just to give the characters something to talk about in the middle of all these murders and creepy phone calls. Nothing more. Again, I haven't seen the 2019 film for myself. I am mostly parroting what people I know have said in terms of the film's writing and what I've seen from the press covering the film, but more and more, it doesn't sound like it's for me. And given its reception, I hope it's converted more people to watch the original. I'll add that it was also fascinating to discover that there were several attempts over the years to produce a sequel for the 1974 film. After the 2006 remake sort of bombed commercially and critically, Bob Clark began early work on a sequel before he tragically passed away in 2007 in a head-on car collision. It was said that Olivia Hussey and John Saxon were to reprise their roles of Jess Branford and Lieutenant Fuller, respectively. In fact, Jess would have become the new house mother of the sorority house in Clark's rough treatment for the film. Now, the two actors are still around. I think Saxon may be pushing his mid 80s, but they are finding occasional work these days, according to IMDb. But a definitive sequel to Black Christmas just doesn't look possible right now, and really, I think it's for the better. I can only imagine that building on the original story would detract from the nebulousness of the 1974 film and just would be unnecessary.
Black Christmas, starring Olivia Hussey, Keir Dullea, Margot Kidder, and starring John Saxon as Lieutenant Fuller. If this movie doesn't make your skin crawl, it's on too tight.
Black Christmas to me marks an impressive early staple in the slasher subgenre at a time when it was still finding its place among its more contemporary horror peers. It isn't without its flaws. Sometimes the film print is a little rough in parts and could use a cleanup. The dialogue and editing can occasionally be hokey or dated too. But what really sells the film is the ambience and the tone of just pure dread and darkness, accompanied by the small-scale world building and calculated pace, making it feel truly unique to this day. It's a film with stylistic roots from some past films, like various giallo flicks that come before, but the film really takes serious liberties to not only thrill and immerse the viewer, but also keep you guessing and leave things open-ended in the best way possible. In less capable hands, not being given any further answers or earning a sense of resolution at the end can sometimes create a negative slant for a film, but similar to a story like Picnic at Hanging Rock, for example, where a few schoolgirls completely disappear on a field trip, never to be heard from or seen again, really taps into those fears of what we don't know and may never know. And Black Christmas reveals probably the perfect amount of information with powerful execution, and I do think that's why it has held this cult status for so long. The mystery lives on in the last shot of the film, which in itself mimics the opening shot of the film, setting everything up for a psychological nightmare in that very sorority house. And I think I'll end it there. Guys, I'm trying some new approaches to revisiting old classics that continue to slip under the radar, and hopefully this was a successful short podcast or audio essay by yours truly, and I might consider doing something like this again in the near future. On the side, my buddy and I have a themed podcast we hope to get started on, and we're really excited to get it going, but it will probably be a little while before it gets the green light. Please don't hesitate to leave any feedback, of course, and I always encourage people to join in the discussion of why we love film and where the medium winds up next. It's greatly appreciated. And it's funny too, the cinematologist who I followed for quite some time in various social media platforms and kindly followed me back, actually recently dropped a new episode of Dissecting Cinema, his podcast, covering this very film as well. You should check that out. Give it a listen. It's very good stuff, and they spend the last few minutes reading Rotten Tomatoes reviews of the 2019 remake, so you'll get a good laugh too. That's Dissecting Cinema over on podbean.com by The Cinematologist. To keep up with more of my content and memes, you can follow me over at facebook.com at FilmChow Productions, as well as at Jeremobie on Twitter and letterboxd.com. That's Jeremobie on Twitter and letterboxd.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and be sure to have a very Merry Black Christmas and a Happy New Year. Much love, everybody.